When I fall in love, I get dizzy. I fall out there just down.
This is Historical Hotties, a podcast where we go through different categories of historical figure and try and figure out which one is the biggest babe.
Still.
Welcome to Historical Hotties. I am your host, Whitney Nelsen, and this is your other host, the second born but equally great,
Lindsey Nelsen.
Let me break down the stees. We have picked a category of historical person. This week, the category is glam rock. We picked without the other's knowledge, and we are going to give you the full business sales pitch on why our hottie is the hottest hottie. We're going to each take a few minutes to give you the bio of our picks, and then we score our hotties on 4 categories. Those categories are physical attractiveness, mental attractiveness, social impact, and what we are calling je ne sais quoi. And then once we've got that rubric scored out on a scale of 1 to 5, we use the numbers to determine which hottie is the hottest hottie. Lindsay, would you like to go first with your pick?
Why, thank you, Whitney. I would like you all to take a moment and freak out with me in a Moon Age daydream as we contemplate the rock god, David Bowie. The person for whom you could literally look up a dictionary definition of glam rock, and there would be David Bowie. David Bowie, originally born David Robert Jones in 1947 in England, chose the name David Bowie after the American adventurer Jim Bowie, for whom the Bowie knife is named, because Davy Jones of the Monkees was getting popular at the same time that Davy Jones / David Bowie was starting his music career, and he didn't want them to be confused. He never would explain to anybody why he picked Jim Bowie for his new last name, but David Bowie revolutionized culture with not just his music, but his image and the characters he assumed at different points in his musical exploration. Bursting onto the scene in the 70s with Ziggy Stardust, probably one of the most popular and well-known figures in rock history to this date. Incredibly revolutionary, not just with the music he was playing, but with this persona of this androgynous, exotic spaceman. Ziggy became so popular that Bowie actually felt like he was taking over his life a little bit and not knowing where David Bowie ended and Ziggy Stardust began. So after a year of incredible popularity touring as Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars, at the end of their major world tour, announced that they were retiring and breaking up and would never play again. And most people would never be able to come back from retiring at this, huge peak swell of your popularity. And he re-emerged as Aladdin Sane for his second album, again a glamorous, androgynous, mysterious kimono-wearing figure this time. And he continued to reinvent himself as he followed his musical inspiration, giving us everyone from the cocaine-addled Thin White Duke to Goblin Kings to the Elephant Man as he moved into acting outside of his musical characters as well. David Bowie, as this inhuman rock god, chameleon, ever-evolving artist, was staggering not just in his initial impact. Ziggy Stardust alone would have been enough to change the face of music in the 20th century, but to keep going for an entire career spanning a 69-year life and continue to innovate and give us something new and give us something intriguing and inspiring, always ahead of the curve. I think David Bowie stands out as among the top figures in rock history and easily the hottest.
Okay, thank you, Lindsay, for that passionate tirade.
You're quite welcome. I have many of them in me.
Well, my pick is Lou Reed. Well, he started as a songwriter and driving force behind Velvet Underground. He got right in at the beginning of glam rock and became a fixture in the brief period of time that glam rock was at its peak. some of the things that you are attributing to David Bowie are really things that could be attributed to everyone at the time. There were multiple personas for almost every single band that was notable in glam rock, including the New York Dolls, which is one of my favorites and almost was my pick as a collective whole. The sometimes feminine and androgynous style with makeup and lyrics that glam masculinity pulled from, they're often overtly queer gender bending as a genre. Not David Bowie specific, and certainly not David Bowie invented, but all of them challenge the counterculture of rock and the assumption that heterosexuality is normal, which is one of the big things that made glam rock such a standout, and why kind of all of the people in the category of glam rock are pretty attractive people as a whole. Lou Reed was the kind of sex, drugs, and rock and roll persona that people dream to have but never can achieve. He was defiantly self-destructive in different ways that changed based on his music and persona as he went, in a way that's just so truly at its core rock and roll. He went straight from the Velvet Underground and hanging out with Andy Warhol in the Factory with the amphetamine crowd, straight to fully embracing and often embodying the heroin chic of glam rock. He is the ultimate bad boy, going from sullen and moody and tortured to sentimental and poetic, and seeing the beauty in the ugliness that is so attractive to almost everyone that has a pulse. We all love somebody that is tortured that we can change. He was born in 1942 in Brooklyn, and as a child, his mother sent him to electroshock therapy to treat his quote-unquote homosexual tendencies. In his life, his second longest relationship was with a trans woman named Rachel. She seemed to be like a very calming rock in a storm of feisty behavior and fights and confrontations. He later married a woman who was a dominatrix on the side, and that was his, I believe, second marriage out of 3 total. He may have been the first out bi musician ever.
David Bowie was an out bi musician. In fact, he talks about meeting his first wife while they were simultaneously laying the same bloke.
But that was after Lou Reed was an out bi musician.
I don't have dates on this. Do you have dates on this?
No, I don't.
Okay, well then you don't know that he did it first.
Well, I know Lou Reed was making music before David Bowie was making music.
Yeah, but you don't know that he was out as bisexual before David Bowie was out as bisexual.
That's true. I do know that he talked very early on about the electroshock therapy for his homosexual tendencies, so.
That is true.
Just in conclusion, he was rude and brash, but he was sensitive. One of the most influential musicians in all of history. So many musicians trace directly back to Lou Reed. There's a quote that Velvet Underground only sold 30,000 records, but every single person that bought one of those 30,000 records immediately went on to make an influential band. And that's my pick.
Alright, well, definitely both picked icons of the rock pantheon in general, and certainly of the 70s and the height of glam rock. Mm-hmm. David Bowie's better.
Alright, so now to the rubric. Lindsay, talk about the physical attractiveness.
Oh, so much physical attractiveness.
And then rank your hottie.
Alright, so, David Bowie, I admit that he might not be everybody's ideal of the pinnacle of male attractiveness, is probably my first crush on a real person and not a fictional character, so, I mean, those party-colored eyes, those cheekbones that could cut glass, the tall lankiness, the thinness when he was, in his early career as Ziggy Stardust, to the cragginess that he developed later on in life as he got older, and he was doing movies and theater, and he was playing Pontius Pilate, and Jareth the Goblin King, obviously, the sexual awakening of many a teenage girl in the 80s. I just think he is the pinnacle of this mysterious, exotic, spacey, otherworldly creature, and I give him a 5 out of 5 easy.
Okay, so I'm going to have to maybe lose a few friendships here. I don't think David Bowie is very sexy.
How is that possible?
I think he's kind of a pale, scrawny scarecrow. He didn't really have a really good refined jaw until a little bit later on in his life. That came with age, and I feel like that's one of the characteristics of British people that defines immediately to me whether or not they're attractive is the jawline.
I will give you that the jaw got better with age. And he had very British teeth.
Yep, very British teeth, which is a huge deal breaker for me. And this is not to say that I don't violently love David Bowie, because I do, but I just don't. Physical attractiveness, he's a 3 for me.
Oh my gosh, a 3! You're killing me. How is that possible?
Yeah, that's... would you like to talk about mental attractiveness now?
Well, you need to talk about the physical attractiveness of Lou Reed first.
Okay. For the general population, Lou Reed is about 1,000 times more attractive than David Bowie. He was very tall, dark, and handsome. He had this, mop of curly dark hair. His eyes were so, sensitive and brooding. And, it depends on the persona that he was embodying at the time, but he did all of it so well. He did the feminized, androgynous glam rock so well. He did a very sort of goth before goth was goth that he did very well, that was not over the top, but was nail polish and dark eyes. And most of the time, when he was himself and not portraying a character on stage, he was very, very James Dean-ish. He definitely, later on in life, started to look a little haggard from the amount of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. He did not age well, and I will say that. But at his prime, he was much taller, he was more muscular, he was just a little bit more of an all-around solid bad boy. I would give him a 5 for physical attractiveness.
Okay, now, at the risk of losing some friends myself on this age, we're going to take a minute and talk about the Boris Karloffian shape of his head, maybe? For just a second. And how Frankenstein-y he was. I will give you that he had a James Dean cool very well. He could look to the side with a cigarette dangling out of his mouth. But yeah, it's a little square, a little Frankenstein-y, and he did not age well. Whereas David Bowie possibly only got sexier as he got older. He did go the Mick Jagger, wrinkly, sex, drug, and rock and roll haggard way.
We are not talking about them later in their careers. We are talking about historical hotties of glam rock.
Yeah, and I still gotta go kind of Frankenstein-y. And I like my rockers.
No. Much better jaw, much better eyes and hair and
I do love the tousled curly mop. I will give you that it was pretty fantastic hair at peak Lou Reed. Yeah, I mean, there's good hair, good cool vibe, but yeah, I never thought his head was proportional, and I'm gonna go with a 3.
Okay. Mental attractiveness, Lindsay. David Bowie, go.
Bowie was so intellectually intriguing, a very intelligent and complex, but also sensitive person, who always continued to push himself and discover new things in music, and was interested in all kinds of forms of art, and had that rock and roll desire to try the subversive and the freaky and the fringe, just to have done it and experienced it and widened your horizons. I mean, there isn't anybody I would rather spend an evening... Well, I mean, maybe there isn't. He's in the top 5 people if I could just sit in a room for a night with a bottle of wine and talk about life and the universe with. He would be in my top picks. So I would have to say 5 out of 5.
I feel exactly the same way about David Bowie that I feel about Johnny Depp, which is that when he was young, he had really interesting ideas and an interesting way of looking at the world, and he was intelligent, but as time goes on and he's famous, he gets catered to and put on something of a pedestal, and they tend to, like, live in mental castles of craziness that they've built themselves brick by brick over years of being a unique thinker and also being famous. And I feel like David Bowie mental attractiveness is greatly diminished shortly after the height of the glam rock period. Since we're talking about glam rock, I have to... I'll score him a 4. Maybe I'll score him a 5, because he was very interesting and very smart, and definitely saw things in a unique way. So I will say 5 there. But I do feel like, just like I feel about Johnny Depp, I feel like at some point no one stopped them and said, hey, let's just check your ego for a second and be part of the real world.
I mean, I admit that there's a level of celebrity that removes you from reality, because none of your experiences anymore are normal or relatable. But, I mean, he was so forward-thinking in more than just art. He, not only was on the forefront of the world getting interested in space and everything like that with the beginning of, Apollo projects and everything like that, but jumped on the internet earlier than almost anybody else. He had the first song available for download over the internet of any musician in the world. The first one to put his own music available for download over the internet before anybody else was contemplating doing that. And also the first one to create a fan site for himself at Bowie.net, or for himself and his work, which I get that you could say like a little vague, but also would pop in under the name Sailor, as in Hello Sailor, and chat personally with his fans.
Okay. Yeah, I scored a 5, so you don't really need to argue with me anymore on this.
I know, you're just saying that he peaked in the 70s, and I don't think that's true.
Okay. I'm not saying that he peaked in the 70s, I just think it was the beginning of the end of that's when he starts laying the foundation of his castle of crazy.
I don't know. I mean, I think the Thin White Duke period, when he was having cocaine problems and everything like that, he got very out of touch, crazy. But I think by, well into the mid-'80s, after the Berlin period, where he kind of did some very moody stuff, worked out a lot of issues, and came back as a more real person, less castle of crazy after that. You need to talk about Lou Reed.
Lou Reed's whole thing was, like I said earlier, finding the beauty in the ugliness. And regardless of anything he went through in his life, regardless of what type of music he was making, he was like a shit-kicking bad boy, rough and tumble, hard living kind of a guy on the outside. But on the inside, he really was just a very poetic, romantic, sensitive person. And I just think having that point of view in the world of nothing's ever going to be perfect. There's a lot of stuff out there that's a hot damn mess, but there's beauty in all of it, and you have to find it and talk about it, is just incredible. I will say the level of a lot of his discourse wasn't nearly the level of discourse of David Bowie, so I do have to say that I think that he ranks a 4 in mental attractiveness. But I do think that he's very mentally attractive.
I will agree that he has a poetic introspection and almost like Byronic introspection that is attractive. And the dichotomy between the sort of very aggressive, Sid Vicious-y exterior and the more poetic sort of interior is a very intriguing play, in a personality back and forth. So I would give Lou Reed a 4 in mental attractiveness.
Okay. We agree there. Alright, social impact.
I mean, while I acknowledge the influence of Lou Reed and the Velvet Underground, and like you're saying that, they might not have had a wide audience, but every one of their fans left and started a band, I still don't think it comes close to the level of impact that David Bowie had on culture. Not only did different phases of his musical exploration directly influence punk, proto-metal, goth rock, new romantics, new wave, electronica, even grunge, 2-year period in the 80s when he started the Tin Men. They were sort of the proto-grunge band. But even outside of his incredible body of work, which 27 studio albums in one lifetime spanning all of these different genres of music, his influence on fashion and art and cinema, I think, are still major influences in the culture today and will continue to be in art moving forward.
Okay.
And also from a social aspect, like a lot of people talk about, and I'm sure you can make this argument for Lou Reed too, but his androgyny, his gender bending, his open bisexuality and homosexuality and all that kind of thing, being some of the first in mainstream culture that people could look at and think that there was something outside of the convention of, the 50s and the early 60s and everything, that were different ways of being and embracing that weirdness instead of trying to conform.
Okay. What do you rank?
I think about as influential as an artist can be on culture, so I'm going to give him a 5 out of 5. I love David Bowie.
Okay, 5 out of 5 for you. I am not going to tell you my rank until I talk to you about the social impact of Lou Reed, because David Bowie is on paper as having said that he would not be making music if it were not for Lou Reed and the Velvet Underground.
Yeah. Yeah, as soon as I heard who your hottie was, I was worried you were going to bring that up.
He is the most cited influence in the history of rock and roll. Like, on paper, in quotes, with journalists. One of the biggest deals in music for influence of any person ever. And David Bowie has specifically said that he would not be who he was without the influence of Lou Reed and seeing Lou Reed play. So, with that being said, I'm going to give David Bowie a social impact of 3 and Lou Reed a social impact of 5.
Okay, I will give you that Lou Reed is the Louis C.K. of, glam rock 70s rockers. That everybody who, he is a musician's musician, and a bunch of people who were fans of him went out and made great music that had a great impact. I still think you're lowballing David Bowie, because I still think Lou Reed was a specific isolated influence who influenced a lot of people who went out and made more art, which does perpetuate and spread the message, and, wouldn't necessarily have been artists or that kind of artist without him as an inspiration. But I think that David Bowie was able to reach more people who would never stumble across or listen to Lou Reed. So, I'm standing by my 5. I will give Lou Reed a 5 for social impact, as well. I think you're lowballing David Bowie with a 3. I really think you are.
Okay. I'm not saying that he didn't have an impact on people. I just think that all of the music types that you cited as David Bowie having influence, Lou Reed also influenced. I think all of the gender stuff, from the reading that I've done, he was the first out by musician. Now, I do have to check dates for David Bowie to see where we fall on that scale, but as far as that part of the argument, with gender bending and androgyny and not really needing to put labels on things, and having been in a long-term relationship with a trans woman, he's equal to, if not more, impactful than David Bowie. Mainly because... Yeah, go ahead.
I will give you that he might have been more radical in his personal life than David Bowie. He might be more extreme in his questing and experimenting and openness, and that kind of stuff. And that influenced a lot of people. But I'm saying that his influence was already people more on the fringes, and David Bowie was able to reach a much wider audience. People who would never hang out with the factory crowd or, the club scene and stuff like that, who were already more towards the fringes of society, were exposed to David Bowie.
I think just as many people on the inside and the fringes at the time were exposed. I think that Lou Reed didn't succeed in maintaining commercial success, but I don't necessarily know that commercial success equals social impact.
I think it gives you more reach. It's gonna get sad now, but if you look at just recently when David Bowie died, and how many people had a personal grieving experience with that, how many people had a personal connection to David Bowie and his work, and how much, it hit them at an important time in their teenage years, or they found it late, but I think anybody would have, be sad at Lou Reed's passing and kind of stuff. It was such a personal and huge reaction when David Bowie died.
Yeah, that's true. As a counter to that, Bono got up on stage with U2 and said, every song we've ever written was a ripoff of a Lou Reed song. I mean, U2 is one of the biggest bands in the entire world.
Right, but Madonna also basically says she would not be Madonna if she hadn't snuck out to see a David Bowie concert when she was 15.
And David Bowie said he wouldn't be David Bowie without Lou Reed.
Yeah, and neither Lou Reed or David Bowie would exist without Chuck Berry, and they both said as much.
Okay, well, we put in our scores, so the last category is Je ne sais quoi.
I mean, this rating is going to come as no surprise to anybody who's been listening this far into the debate, but a 5 for David Bowie.
I'm scoring a 5 for both, because I think the whole reason that we are so passionate about this is because both of them had a certain something that you just can't deny.
Yeah, you can't look away from either of them, I will give you that. If they were on a stage or in a room, they are magnetic, they have complex personalities and emotional landscapes. Yeah, I will give them both a 5.
I do also want to point out David Bowie and Lou Reed were extremely close friends.
And collaborators. They worked on some musical pieces together.
They worked on each other's albums more than once. David Bowie actually produced one of Lou Reed's albums. Lou Reed played on a lot of David Bowie's albums. There's a story with actual, photographs, I guess. I wasn't able to see the photographs, but the story was recorded of a time in a restaurant where they got into a fight and Lou Reed pulled David Bowie across the table and they scuffled on the floor until they were pulled apart, and then after cooling down they actually literally kissed and made up in the restaurant.
Which, how hot would that have been to see?
So I do want to say that, in spite of all of this, they are both big deals.
Yeah.
And they were both very close to one another. So I think that they would probably appreciate
each other's, yes,
this whole conversation that we're having.
Yeah. I think they would probably join in on the opposite side of the debate if they were here.
Yeah, exactly. So, all that being said, I have the totals of our rankings, and we've both voted very differently in some places. Lindsay voted a lot of 5s all down the board for hers. In fact, only 5s all down the board for hers. I did not vote all down the board 5s for anybody, so I just want to put that out there. Someone's clearly pushing hard for their pick.
And I promise that I will not, I'm not going to always be, in favor of my candidates, but David Bowie is a part of who I am as a person. If I hadn't found David Bowie when I was 14, I don't know who I'd be, but I'd be somebody else.
That's fair. However, when all is said and done, we have an exact tie.
Oh my gosh, really? Even with you lowballing David Bowie on Social Impact?
We have an exact tie. We are at 36 points per hottie.
Well, I think, like you were saying, they would probably be happy with the ranking of, twin crown princes of glam.
I think so, too. So, listeners, we will leave it to you to decide who you think won. I think Lindsay thinks she knows who won, and I think I know who I think won. But we'll leave it up to you to decide who won.
So nobody in this room was convinced to this day.
And that is the show. Thank you for joining us.
To talk about some hot rock and rollers.
Bye.